Well, welcome to Doubts Aloud. My name's Michael Roberts. I am a hybrid or a mutant between a geologist and a vicar. As I started life as a geologist, became a vicar, and I'm very interested in the interaction between the two.
Wow. And that, dear listeners, is why we've invited him to be our guest. So
Excellent.
I'm Ed, and Andrew's here.
Yeah.
But sadly, Francis can't make it this time. Michael, this is brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on. And we already know why it's just such a treat that you're with us for this hour or so. And well, there's so much to unpick already. Tell us a bit about how you got into geology and some of your experience as a geologist.
Well, in geology, I enjoyed the outside world as a kid. My geography teacher was more of a geologist and a mountaineer, and I picked both those things up for him. And I studied geology at university. When I finished, I went out to Africa as a geologist, and I was really getting somewhere in geology, but I felt my position was actually the ordained ministry, and then went back to Durham and did theology there. And I'd come across creationism, which I wasn't very happy with, and I felt I maybe have something to contribute. And I got particularly interested in all the historical aspects of the relationship of Christianity and geology. And also, almost by accident, I got into Darwin's geology in Wales, because before he went on the Beagle, he had a very important geological trip around Wales. And I've done that in great detail.
Yeah, and that's just something I knew nothing about until I've spoken to you about it.
You can even do better. You can go on. There are 2 field trips for 5 days each, taking place in May and September. So you could go on that.
Okay, so make sure we've got something in our show notes for people to pick up and link on for that. I think what we're going to do is a bit like a brief history of time. We're going to have a brief history of Christian understanding of time in terms of the age of the earth. That's a sort of broad where we're going. And I'd love to start not so much at the beginning, but just before the famous Bishop Ussher and his dating of the earth, where the state of Christian theology and understanding of the age of the earth was at that time, which would have been, 1600 or so.
I think, actually, I would like to go back a little bit earlier, before Martin Luther started banging notes on churches, as the whole way that the church understood time, eternity, and the existence of the earth is absolutely fascinating.
So when was this person writing and thinking?
I'm going to mention quite a few.
Oh, okay. I thought you mentioned a particular person, but I missed
No,
that.
there are quite a few.
Right.
And we have the usual picture that Ussher is the typical Christian over the last 2,000 years, believing in an earth a few thousand years old, all literally happening as we might like to read Genesis. But it's more complicated than that. And if we go back to the early church, going right through the so-called Dark Ages, which never existed, into the Middle Ages, which did exist and was a time of great Christian intellectual endeavor, people were looking at the time in which everything was created in several different ways. There were those who thought it was young earth, or what I would call shallow time. They just took the Bible as a perfect chronology. And so if you followed the Greek version, you'd end up with creation in 5,500 BC. Or if you followed the Hebrew version, it was 4,000 BC. And that was a very strong minority view over the ages. And of course, Ussher is somebody who comes out of that. But then there were others who did not take Genesis quite so literally, and they realized that the earth was much older. And they looked to Aristotle as well for this type of thing, and Plato. And they had a very vague understanding, but a very real understanding, that the earth was ancient, but still had a beginning in time. And then there were those who thought the earth has existed eternally. But that was squashed on the head in 1215 in the Fourth Lateran Council, where they could no longer believe that the earth was eternal. But the other one, which I think is very significant because it spills over into all sorts of things, is what I call chaos in the shallow end. Taking the understanding of the chronologists, but saying there's more than that. God originally created chaos and then later reorganized this. And this particularly goes back to the Latin writer Ovid in his rather long poem, Metamorphoses. And so there were these sort of almost 4 different strands. And so when we come to our friend Mr. Ussher, who I think was an absolutely brilliant scholar, but a man of his time, after the Reformation...
So just remind us exactly when Ussher was writing.
He wrote in 1656.
Lovely.
I've got his book 6 feet away from me.
And so just Michael, so this was the this is where when people are talking, when we get into sort of people talk about the age of the earth in Christianity, this is the figure, this is the guy where people go back to for the for a believed chronology of the Bible, and they often reference Bishop Ussher. Yeah, they
think he's the only one, but in the 1800s, one person worked out there were 160 of them. Right. And they had various ages. There was a good number at 5,500 BC, and then there were a good number at 4,000 BC. So Ussher wasn't the only one, but he was typical of many of these chronologists.
He gets all the credit, yeah.
And well, he gets the credit this side of the channel, but not the other.
Right.
And but there was still the undercurrent where they had this idea, particularly of this idea that God created chaos first, and then after some time, he reordered it.
Yeah, I think that's straight from Genesis 1, isn't it?
No, I think it's a particular interpretation sliding in Ovid's Metamorphoses into the text. Genesis 1 itself doesn't really say that if you look at it carefully. And it was the people in the early church who sort of combined the two. It was really...
It just came in on there. It's my understanding of mainstream scholarship, Hebrew scholarship on Genesis 1 itself, seems to be pretty dominant now on the idea that it really should have meant when God began to create, and therefore he's forming and filling stuff that's already there. What can you say about that?
That one.
Oh, right, okay. That does seem to be a common view now.
It's a common view.
Yeah.
But probably I'm fairly trad on this, that I do accept there was a point of creation.
The point of creation. I think the idea...
creation is sort of, it's not just one, series of static events like the creationists who say, well, it's all explained. And God said he made it with his word. It's much more complex, and I actually totally accept the standard geological evolutionary picture.
Oh, no, I wasn't thinking about that. It was more
I was thinking of all the separation going on.
Yeah, it was it's forming, and that the idea is that we don't know where light. What was it? Earth.
Separation of light and dark and water.
Formless
and
earth, water, and darkness. We're always not always there, but that's all we know. We start at that point, and then he starts to mess about with darkness, water, and the earth, and then it separates.
The sky above separates.
I wouldn't link up the expressions in Genesis with any kind of modern science of what actually happened.
No,
we're not doing that.
No, I wouldn't do that
much
at all.
More,
see
it as a picture put in the thought forms of the day.
And
what I've never heard before is the idea that this order out of chaos isn't just people reading the Hebrew text carefully. Actually, it's being imposed on the text by a culture that was steeped in Ovid.
Yes,
Ovid. That's completely new for me.
it's very much coming out. Well, there's a recent book which I'm in the other room, so I'd have to go and get it.
Yeah.
Where he stresses some of the most popular books on this type of line in the Middle Ages were Ovid, Metamorphoses, Pliny's work, and I think Seneca. I'd have to look them up. And it's quite interesting that they were just sort of, as it were, melded together as with the pictures say that knowledge is a unity and it's not to be just separated.
Right.
So I got you thinking then.
Yeah, that's right. You certainly have.
Yeah, that's a different thought for sure.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, we'll carry on then.
Let's speed on.
Yeah.
So certainly in the English world, there were beginning to be some inklings from science that was guiding us towards an older and older Earth. So, could you give us a quick history of that?
Well, there was probably quite a lot going on, but particularly we get after 1660 when, after the Restoration and then the formation of the Royal Society, that was a great flowering of science, and it's much more than just sort of Newton and other physicists. There were various people there. Robert Hooke was very good on earthquakes, who seemed to think the Earth was a bit older. And I think one of the most interesting ones, which particularly someone who likes climbing in North Wales, or I did before I got a bit decrepit, that Edward Llwyd, who was a Welshman and went to school in Oswestry, and he was a great antiquary based in Oxford. And in Nant Peris, the valley coming up from Llanberis, with Snowdon on one side and the Gliders on the other, there are a remarkable number of boulders all over the place. And he inquired about everything, and he found that in living memory, only 2 boulders had ever fallen down. So you could say roughly that they could come down at 30-year intervals, but there are hundreds of them. And that would point to the Earth being much, much older than 4000 BC. He was totally wrong geologically, because they're erratic blocks brought down by the glaciers about 20,000 years ago. But it was a very interesting thought he had. But there are others in the late 17th century who had inklings that the Earth was older. And so if you look at the theories of the Earth, which were very popular there, they often had a mixture of stuff. Little bit of, certain amount from Genesis, certain amount from our dear gentleman Ovid, and a certain amount of geological stuff put in, and of course a lot of speculation. So there was a breaking away from Ussher's 4004, and probably among the better educated people, that probably was the dominant view, although the other kept creeping up.
Yeah.
Right.
And how much were the clergy involved with this? Because of the typical pitch you have is of the local clergyman spending all his spare time with his trowel or whatever, digging about, or the naturalist in Sherborne. Kind of citizen scientists who are actually clergy. There seem to be quite a few of them.
Yeah, well, you need to go back to early 1660s to Tuscany in Italy, when you realize the person who gave the idea of the superposition of rocks, where the oldest is at the bottom and the youngest at the top, Neil Steno. He was originally a Lutheran, then became a Roman Catholic, and shortly after he did his major work, he became a bishop. And then others in that late 17th century, the theories of the Earth, the Reverend John Ray, and various others, ordained people who may or may not have been academics as such at university. So there were a fair number, and others who were not ordained. It was a mixture.
Yeah. But the feeling was... Sorry. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's really, really fascinating about, and when I was looking into this many, many years ago, and then ever since, this whole idea that, when you get this young Earth reaction against its atheistic worldviews, and it's like all coming from biases of a non-God worldview, when actually these early geologists were evangelical, a lot of them, and even people surrounding Darwin, there were lots of them were just Christian people adapting to the evidence as it was coming in. And, even the guy who mooted the first idea for the Big Bang, I think, was a Roman Catholic priest.
Oh, yeah.
Would you be able to
Well, I
comment on
mean,
that, Mike?
this is the whole point that, I mean, you'll get it both with Christian Ministries International and Answers in Genesis. They're very strong in saying it comes out of the Enlightenment or the Endarkenment,
Yes,
they
that's
call
right.
it, and they say it was got no evidence whatsoever. This belief, if it's an old Earth, it disproves Christianity, and it's complete nonsense.
Mm.
They
Sorry
give
to
a
sum it
cast
up in
iron
one word.
reason, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, if you go through the 18th century, you'll find there's a whole shade of opinion between Christians who may or may not be ministers to people who are not. They might be deists like Hutton, and there are others who are more antagonistic to the Christian faith, like the encyclopedists. And it does seem that they really gave the idea that the correct Christian view, if you're a proper Christian, would be to believe in a young Earth.
Right.
So it's sort of
Oh, so what sort of
sidelined.
time? When were these people? I've not
18th
heard of
century.
18th century. So,
Yeah.
so there were the Ken Hams of the day.
No, the encyclopedists tried to paint the
there were secular people who said that if you are to
yes,
be
if you are
consistent,
a Christian, you have to be a Ken Ham.
right. I see. Interesting. So
Yeah.
they
I'm
even
very
saw
annoyed
it.
about Ken Ham because when he first got a website up, he was very critical of a vicar who upset him in Liverpool, and then he removed it. He also didn't
Right.
name the vicar, which I wish he had done.
Yeah.
I see.
It wasn't you, clearly.
Oh no, obviously not.
Okay, so obviously, what's going to hit with a bang is The Origin of Species in 1859. So just before then, what was the state of understanding of the age of the Earth and the theological side of it, or in discussion in the church?
Well, quite interestingly, from about 1800, the majority of educated Christians, whether they're lay or not, and you have to say educated because those who got very little schooling would just simply, take for granted the Bible was literally true, and they'd noticed a little 4004 in the top right-hand corner. But most accepted some kind of geological time. And you got this coming out because so many of the early geologists were Christians of one form or another. And interestingly, that, William Smith, who produced the first map in 1815, was in fact got tremendous help from 3 Anglican clergy, particularly Joseph Townsend, who wrote quite an interesting book in 1810. And then as we move ahead, we get to the whole lot, and particularly clerical geologists like William Conybeare, Adam Sedgwick, William Buckland, and John Henslow, although we usually think of John Henslow as a botanist. And they all argued for very much an old Earth. And it was Henslow and Sedgwick who were really Darwin's main geological teachers and taught him all the basics of geology until he started reading Lyell while he was at sea.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay.
by 1850, I should have said in 1817, books were coming out trying to say the Earth was actually created in 6 days flat. And the first person to do it was a chap called Gisborne, who was in fact the last patient Erasmus Darwin saw before he died. It's just a nice little irony. Yeah. And you've got a spate of them in the 1820s. And really, they are abysmally bad geology when measured by the standards of geology in the 1820s.
Yeah.
And people like Sedgwick, a good evangelical, absolutely hammered them.
Yeah.
So they'd gone virtually defunct by 1855.
Yeah.
Question that I was going to ask on this level is, were in opposition to the way the young Earth crowd sort of say that, that you're coming to the rocks with a bias, an anti-supernatural, anti-God bias. They weren't. Were a lot of them coming to sort of almost at first prove, say, Noah's flood, and that we thought, well, the Noah's flood must have caused the geology, and then came to discover slowly, it doesn't quite work.
Well,
The
I
evidence
think
is
that's
going far different than that. Yeah.
That's a very fair comment. If
Yeah.
you go back to the 17th century, as they first going around looking at the rocks, it was almost taken for granted that all the sedimentary rocks were laid down by the flood, and then it didn't quite seem to work. So we're modifying it. So by the time you got to the arch-diluvialist, William Buckland, he was really saying that the Noah's flood only deposited the last 30 feet of strata.
Right.
All the rest were much, much earlier. And then, of course, that gradually was seen not to work, and it was explained by the ice ages.
So, see, the reason I'm interested in that is that when it's accused that you're not looking at the world through biblical eyes, and they were trying their best to do it with that understanding, and then they were just persuaded by the evidence that it was not so. And I think that's quite powerful, because it means you're thinking about the flood as you look at the rocks, and then you're going, oh, can't have all happened in one big flood. Oh dear. Right. Okay. Well, we'll accept that though, and not deny it. So to me, that's quite powerful. It's not saying it can't have been one flood with a pre-assumption. They found out that it wasn't just one flood just by looking at the rocks. Yeah. That seems to be the way. Yeah.
I think that's a very fair comment. People can sometimes mock the early geologists for thinking it was all laid down in the flood, but it was the obvious thing to look at initially, because historical evidence was thin, but the flood appeared not only in the Bible, it would appear in a lot of other writers, Greek and Latin.
Babylonian.
So, and that was before they found the Babylonian ones. So
really? Right.
It just seemed to make sense that the flood laid down all the rocks.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
And then it literally did not hold water.
Yeah. Very good. Yes.
Okay, so just before we jump into Darwin, what do you know about other cultures like the Catholics or the nonconformists or other going elsewhere in Europe and even Jews? I haven't asked you about this before. What debates you're aware of in those other communities?
Well, I am aware that some rabbis thought the earth was incredibly ancient in the Middle Ages, but I'm not well up in it. I may as well say I'm not. When it comes to the Roman Catholics, I think it has to be said that they take a fairly similar view, that they were just undecided whether the world was ancient or not. When pre-geology, there wasn't the evidence. And then, of course, key founder of geology was Neil Steno, who was a Roman Catholic bishop. He was, in fact, the titular bishop of Titopolis, which is always a good one. And then when you go along a bit further on Roman Catholicism, mid-18th century, and an English priest, Father Needham, wrote some quite lengthy tomes on this, and they were all in French. And he was arguing it didn't matter whether the Earth was 10,000, 10 million, or 100 million years old.
Yeah.
And he was dealing a bit with the geology as well.
Yeah.
In a very limited way. And if you go to the 1830s, just staying in Britain, you got Cardinal Wiseman, who became cardinal later. He wrote a book on relationship of science and religion, and it was basically the same as what the Anglicans were saying.
Yeah.
But there were still those who would object, and there was a reaction after the French Revolution of some French to be so incredibly reactionary Roman Catholic that Chateaubriand, he wrote a book and he argued it was all young and it had all been created with the appearance of old age, but in fact was created young, sort of goss in anticipation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
We had that.
and the
before.
nonconformists, they varied. I can't call them nonconformists. The Scottish Presbyterians were in favour. Hutton sent his work in the 1780s to the moderator of the Church of Scotland and said, "Do you like my preface on Genesis?" And the moderator wrote back and said basically yes, but made a few modifications. Then Hutton's popularizer was the Reverend John Playfair. They often forget to mention he was Reverend. And English nonconformists, they tended to be more literalists initially, but then took things on.
Yeah.
So not a major issue.
Yeah. Now, something that was completely new to me was the idea that Darwin started in geology.
Yes. From his home background, he was picking up all sorts of science and, probably collected anything. And then, of course, he was known for Beatlemania. But when he was at Cambridge, he not only followed around John Henslow on his botanical stuff, but John Henslow had also produced some fantastic pieces of work on geology, Isle of Man and Anglesey. And his work on Anglesey in 1822, I think, must be one of the finest bits of geology ever written. And it was way ahead of its time. And he then swapped over to botany.
Yeah.
And then there was Adam Sedgwick. And in all that, Darwin was interested in the geology. So in the summer of 1831, he started doing some geology on his own. And then on the 2nd of August, Adam Sedgwick, the geologist from Cambridge, arrived in Shrewsbury, and they spent 2 weeks together going around North Wales, doing a lot of field work, and actually went over to Ireland for a weekend as well. And so he picked up a lot. Then he left Sedgwick because he wanted to go back and do some shooting. Right. So he walked over the hills to Barmouth from Bangor, a very interesting route. I can give you all details of that. And then he went back to Shrewsbury, and there was a letter saying, "Do you want to go on the Beagle?" So he arrived on the Beagle as a geologist first and a biologist second.
Yeah.
And in fact, most of his notes in the Beagle were on geology.
All right. Cool.
And I think the most incredible thing is that he went first to Cape Verde, did some interesting geology there. Then there's some islands halfway between Cape Verde and Brazil, St. Paul's Rocks. And they're only about the size of a big garden. And he went there and he took one look at them and said, "Serpentine, these are not volcanic." And it's unusual because these have to be the only islands in the oceans which are not volcanic. And in fact, their upper mantle pushed up.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant piece of geology there.
Yeah.
There are also implications that it means that where had he seen serpentine before, and the only place he could have done it was Anglesey. But that's going on to one of my little things on geology.
Okay.
And
what I'd love to know is, so you say he did this great work. Just generally, not him, but anybody, they were looking at these layers of rocks, and they were working stuff out. So what's the basic technique they're using to work out ages? And it's also very confusing to me when I see rocks in Cornwall all up on edge and all folded and all sorts.
Well, if they're folded, and some of those in Cornwall, and particularly on the north coast, it's just too complicated to work it out at the time. And it's much nicer if you go where everything is flat. And this is really why the geological column was firstly worked out in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, because so much of that is flat lying with clear layers. And if you have a pile of stuff, the oldest is at the bottom.
Yeah.
And the newer stuff is put on. So it's done on the principle of superposition. So you get the oldest at the bottom, then the next thing coming up a bit younger, and so on. So they'd work it out in the order it was laid down. And this is the principle which Neil Steno did in 1660s. It comes out in some work. Well, really, it was a very much an aside thing, which is never published, by John Michel in the 1780s. And then William Smith did it on his map, where it was mostly on which layer of rock was at the bottom. And he also used fossils to give an indication of age as well, because he found empirically that in certain beds you get certain fossils, and another bed you get other fossils. And if you know where they are, you can work out which one's older just by looking at the fossils. And he did this in 2 parallel canals near Bath.
Oh, right.
And if you ever watched the film Titfield Thunderbolt, did you?
Don't know that film.
1950s film. Sorry, I'm ancient. And it's there.
Yes.
It's quite an interesting thing.
Yes.
And so they basically did it. And so that was always an important key. And so they were, when they were trying to sort out Wales from 1831, they were trying to work out the rocks which were immediately below the old red sandstone of Devonian, because they could date that in relation to the Carboniferous above it. So they're looking for what was immediately below it.
Yeah. So are you saying they could tell an old fossil from a more recent fossil?
Well, when you look at if you just look at any book of fossils or find fossils, you'll find fossils are not all the same. And they're only found in particular layers, or most of them. You get some like Lingula, which can be found almost unchained over 400 million years, but others have a very limited time span of a few million years.
Yeah.
So
but you can't tell that an Amorite is older than a some kind of
trilobite
mammal or something until after Darwin and the Tree of Life and everything.
No, you could tell it before.
Oh yeah, this is what I was asking.
The succession of life was worked out way before Darwin, because they were finding the fossils with the different forms of life were all appearing in a fixed order. So in fact, if you look, when they worked out that you only got fish after the Devonian and later, and below that there were only invertebrates, trilobites and the rest of them.
Yeah.
And what they did was a progressive creationism, that every so often God created another batch of life.
Yeah.
They went extinct, and then he created another lot.
Right.
And this is very
great.
Very clear. There's a very good paleontologist who started working in Latin America, D'Orbigny, Frenchman. He was working out in the Jurassic near Arromanches, which of course is where you get the Mulberry Harbour of the D-Day. And he there worked out that there were 57 different layers of different fossils. And to him, what happened was God created a lot, and then they all went defunct. So he created another lot, and he did it 57 times. But the order was there. And of course, Darwin comes along. And in fact, in his notebooks, he argues that it's more sensible just to say they changed into each other.
Yeah, what I was going to say, Michael, on this is that this touches very, very, very nicely into the middle ground people that are around today. And it seems like they are stuck in that period that you just talked about, because the old Earth creationists sort of they laugh at the young Earth in terms of, or mock it, or they just disagree and say that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old or whatever. And so they've got the time span that evolutionists sort of would agree with, but they say, like hugh-ross and that whole movement over there, who are the sort of the other forms of evangelical creationists, they take the old Earth but anti-evolution, and they say what you just said, that those people said, that the Earth is old, but there was this sort of extinction creation at various periods.
The two best examples from 1860 were professors at Oxford and Cambridge. One was the Reverend Adam Sedgwick, an evangelical, who objected to Darwin, wrote a letter, quite sharp letter, and signed it off. Yours faithfully, son of a monkey. So there was definitely humor there. I mean, this is often overlooked, but he would not accept transformation of species. And then the other side, at Oxford, the professor was John Phillips, who was not ordained, who was a Christian, and he hadn't even got a degree, but he was professor at Oxford. He was completely self-taught by his uncle, William Smith, and he was very critical of the origin of species. And he's the one who gave us the terms Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cainozoic. So, in other words, these were top geologists at that time who just did not accept evolution. So they did take the intermediate thing, and gradually they went extinct and were replaced by geologists who were accepting evolution.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because that's exactly a representation today. And it seems to me that that obviously the evidence is very persuasive to the old Earth creationists, but when it comes to accepting evolution, for them it would destroy the theology of the Bible, and therefore they can't go there. That's the way I see it. But we'll get onto that a bit later.
Because
yeah,
the other wonderful old age creationist of the 1860s was a chap called Samuel Wilberforce.
Oh, wow.
Who was Bishop of Oxford, who, when he was an undergraduate, for 3 years in succession, he went to Buckland's lectures. And I think he went more to Buckland's lectures than anybody else, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And in his review, it's clear that he believes in the ancient Earth, but he will not accept evolution, partly because to him it destroys the nature of humanity. In other words, it reduces us to a dumb beast.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is the thing. You get the whole, and that I think is, there's the moral argument where people don't want to see us as animals. And of course, Darwin doesn't help, because he does notice the morality of dogs.
Yes, and today the morality of apes is seen to be very clear.
Well, that's so plain obvious. I mean, I saw that and I just laughed, because I mean, if anybody has had a dog, they will know that the dog has a code of ethics. They vary. Some are horrible, but some are very caring.
Yeah.
And I think any dog owner would say that.
How much was the origin of species a kind of bombshell in all of this, and how much was it just a sort of obvious next step?
Well, that's interesting, because when the papers, the Wallace-Darwin papers, were given at the Linnaean Society in 1858, they didn't create much of a stir. And so the president of the Linnaean Society at the end of 1858 said that there were no significant papers published that year. And there was that Darwin-Wallace pair of papers on natural selection. I think it was really that it could be blown up, because certain things would come out. Some people got very worked up about it, and often with incidents, the people who make most noise are regarded as the most significant. And of course, there was a variety of reactions. And looking at the reactions, the people who are quickest to accept evolution were botanists. And if you're familiar with plants, you'll know that it's damn difficult to tell the difference between some species. And if you take the lovely dandelion, there are 300 subspecies in Britain alone, cool. Which is rather a lot. And you get people who could tell the difference. And then if you look at orchids, is that they just mess around like mad with each other, and they're hybrids all over the place. You also get it with the primulas, and Darwin, following on from Henslow, did work on hybridization of primroses and cowslips, and he called the products illegitimate. So there was this where, the concept of species wasn't very easy to use. So the botanists were the easiest group to accept evolution. Then the zoologists, and the geologists were variable. And then some of the physicists were quite opposed, like Tate and Lord Kelvin.
Right. Yeah.
So within the church, it varied. I mean, remarkable number of clergy did accept evolution from the word go, but that they often prefer to just look at Samuel Wilberforce and make a caricature of it. And the best account of the Wilberforce Huxley debate, so called, is to read Charles Kingsley, The Water Babies, and you'll find a parody of it there, because there was this cleric arguing against this professor. I don't know how you pronounce it because there isn't one vowel in the name.
Yeah.
But if you have a look at the Water Babies, you'll find it. And it was written just after he had had a meeting. Both met his mates, Wilberforce at one day, and then some days later he met his other mate, Huxley. And then he wrote it down as a takeoff in the Water Babies. So it's quite funny when you see a kiddie's book doing a how would you call spitting image version of the Huxley Wilberforce debate.
That's amazing.
It's great fun.
Yeah. So we're kind of tend to be familiar with those early debates, and then my impression is everything calmed down in the first half of the 20th century. Is that right?
Yep, it basically fizzled out. I mean, you got the fundamentals, which was the most evangelical in the States, with a certain input from Britain. Many of them accepted evolution.
And a very old Earth.
And a very old Earth. There were some who were young Earth, but you got, they had a British bishop, Handley Mole from Durham, although he didn't write on it, he believed in evolution. And then you got, there's a Scottish theologian whose name I can't remember offhand. He accepted evolution very much in a Wallace rather than a Darwin sense, and a couple of Americans. But then come 1920s, you of course got the influence of the creationists coming through, the Seventh-day Adventists, Macready Price, and also the various things leading up to the Scopes trial.
Oh, right. Yes, I've forgotten about that. Yes.
Can you say a little bit about the, because again, way back in the day, I can remember that a lot of people were arguing that young Earth creationism really had its modern form through George Macready Price.
Yes.
And then it went across into evangelicalism from Seventh-day Adventism. Yeah.
Yes, that's a fair comment.
Yeah.
But ironically, with Scopes, it was over evolution, not the great age of the Earth, because William Jennings Bryan, who was, arguing against evolution, did believe in an old Earth, and he also believed in evolution up to humans, but he wouldn't allow the last gap between the orangutan and us. So it's quite interesting if you actually look at the transcripts of the Scopes trial.
Yeah.
And do not watch the film Inherit the Wind. That tries to portray everybody as a young Earth creationist when they were not.
Ah, right. No, I'm going to say.
Yeah. So right up to there, that the dominant view in the British churches was almost entirely, you're either an old Earth creationist or an evolutionist. Young Earthers were hardly known.
Yeah.
In the States, among evangelicals, it was more old Earth creationist, but with the young Earth trying to take over, and which of course they started to do effectively in 1961 with the book The Genesis Flood.
Yes. Yeah. So tell us about that, because that seemed, I had it in mind, that was like the start of a new era.
It was. That really started because you had an Old Testament professor, John Whitcomb, and then he got matey with this hydraulic engineer.
Oh, help! I'm a hydraulic engineer, and I'm specialized in sedimentation.
He was a different one. He was a drip under pressure. Henry Morris. A
lot of young Earth creationists are hydraulic engineers.
And they got together because they didn't like this new book which had just come out among American evangelicals, which Bernard Ramm, I can't remember what's this. Is it? Just a minute.
Okay. I'll do a commentary. Michael's gone back to his bookshelf, and here it is.
That is the cause of young-earth creationism. Bernard Ramm, The Christian View of Science and Scripture, I think it's 1955. And there he argued very, very accurately about science and Christianity. He was old Earth, a bit iffy on evolution, but Morris and Whitcomb were offended by it and decided to write this book against it. And so they produced that mammoth tome called The Genesis Flood, which is replete with more references than any academic book would have. And virtually every reference is a misquotation.
Okay.
I read it in a fundamentalist study center in Switzerland, Le Brie, where Francis Schaeffer was. And I upset people by saying it was full of misrepresentation and they didn't like it.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that Whitcomb and Morris's 61 book was drawn heavily from George McBrady Price, Seventh-day Adventist book. I forget what his book was called, but
there was a New Geology.
The New Geology. So they took it from that, and then built upon it. And yes. I can remember I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian home in which that Whitcomb book was the thing. And it was like, this is the way to go. You know, this is Christianity properly understood in terms of geology and evolution, and or anti-evolution. So
made me an atheist.
Yeah, that's probably another way to title the book, isn't it? You're giving a cast house. I never actually read it back then, but it was in the house, and everything was Whitcomb and Morris, and this was a book that could settle the issue. You know, it was like I didn't even know it was drawn from this Seventh-day Adventist guy, and nothing against Seventh-day Adventism, but that's where it came from. That guy in that
I upset them at Le Brie because they had a weekly lecture, and I did it on creationism,
right?
And then must have been 20 years later on holiday in Switzerland, we went up there by coach, and I said we must go. My wife wasn't very keen, and I went in the library, and they had all these foul lectures, which were these weekly lectures. So I looked through for 1971. Mine was missing.
You were expunged.
I was expunged. I was most upset.
Okay, so that was 60 years ago, the Genesis Flood, not your lecture in 1971. So 60 years is a long time. So how's it all panned out since, from your point of view?
Well, I mean, it just doesn't seem to die.
No.
I mean, you got the new speaker of, is it? I'm not sure whether it's the Senate or the House of Representatives.
It'd be the House, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's one. Mike Pence was.
Oh, definitely.
And you go on like that. And,
Mike Pence was very anti-evolution.
You see, the Southern Baptists have now almost entirely young Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to be a much bigger deal in the British Evangelical Church as well than when I was young.
It is. It's they don't seem to have got rid of it, and they're a fair number in the Anglican Church among the clergy. And here's something now, which I've only found one creationist bishop in the Church of England, and you've got a choice which century. 18th, 19th, 20th, or 21st?
Well, I'm going to guess 21st.
You're right. He's long since retired. But it's an interesting comment.
Yeah.
I'll get lynched for that comment.
It'd be interesting to think through the reasons why. I mean, because when I was young, or in the teenagehood, I was brought up in that young earth creationism. But even in the church that I was in, there were evolutionary people, and it was like they were sort of, for me, they were seen as like oddities, strange, or denying the Bible. But they were there. It wasn't like there weren't Christians like that. But I think England was probably quite different. If I'd been in the southern states of America, I think probably everyone around would have been young Earth, even then. But it's just holding on, and it's probably holding on due to the theology of young Earth creationism does have a systematic thing that kind of sounds pretty top-end tailed and works within their field of the narrative of the Bible, but it just doesn't correspond with the world that we physically live in. But the theology of evolutionary creationists is then a little more difficult to navigate because of the world we actually live in, and that's probably why it's still around, because I think really battle.
Most thought is fuzzy, and I think if you're an evolutionary creationist, call you what you like, is certain things are fuzzy and ill-defined. The young Earth creationists get very sharp and pronounced details, and they'll say simply, Genesis 3, the fall of man, you have all the thorns and the thistles, and at that point God put the curse on the planet and death came into the world. And it was only since Adam took a chunk out of the apple that animals started dying. And that actually is very convincing, because they then will say, Jesus died to take away the curse. So if you say, that curse is not there, you deny Jesus. You deny his death on the cross. So in fact, they've got it in a way that if you go for it, as far as they present it, you have destroyed the whole of the Christian faith. But as I point out, Jesus died for people's sins, not for a couple of scrumpers.
The whole issue of suffering, and animal suffering and human suffering, the young Earth and the Adam and Eve and the fall, and then lions not eating flesh until after the fall. It all's crazy, but it does solve an awful lot of problems. Yes. Do you remember, Andrew, we went to that thing in Oxford?
Yes.
The Christians in Science. And it really struck me. This lovely man doing a lecture, and he showed a picture of a leopard that looked amazing in full run. And he said, that is just a killing machine. And
it's developed its strength because of predation.
Yes, and its speed and its everything about it is a killing machine. And if you can just sweep that away by saying, God made everything perfect and good, and that kind of killing aspect only came in after the fall, even if you make it a metaphorical fall, it's still a date in time geologically. Anyway, I'm waffling a bit, and
I know what you're saying. It's like the nature of red and tooth and claw, as they say, has got its own beauty. Is probably not the word, but its own cycle of life and death and all the rest of it. And that was going on millions of years before Homo sapiens eventually came out of all of that. And so,
that type of view was superbly ridiculed by Hugh Miller back in 1856. He just took the mick out of it, how that animals which were created vegetarian suddenly, their teeth grew and their claws grew and all the rest of it when Adam took a chunk out of the fruit.
Yes. I mean, it is ridiculous.
I mean, that when you come to press it on the science side, it just seems to fall apart, doesn't it?
Yes.
Even just no death before the fall. Imagine if there was no fall. I mean, what was the planet going to fill up, or what?
Well, that's been parodied as well, because some of the Oxford friends of William Buckland, pointed about how crowded everything would be if they never got removed.
Yes,
exactly.
Andrew, you told me that of that cartoon making fun of that, and would you know, it goes right back to Buckland in 1820 or 1815 or something.
Which is that? Which cartoon's that?
Oh, I'll send you it. I said we'll put the link in. It's actually somebody has done a great animation on the issue of if there was no fall, they didn't take the apple. If just say it's a literalistic, so it's an attack on young Earth creationism, really, and it's saying that if it did a scenario of no fall, so there's no apple being eaten, so there's no fall, so they're just procreating and procreating, and the world is just piling up with human beings. God finally comes in and says, take the flipping apple. And of course, it's funny, but it makes the point that procreation and death almost can't go together. You have to either stop procreating and then live forever, or you keep procreating and die to make room. I mean, it's an obvious thing, even for a child. And so that animation really brought it clear, that kind of parody, you know.
But some of Buckland's colleagues came out with poetry on the similar theme.
Similar things. So they've all been,
Equally
nothing's
naughty.
new under the sun. It's all been
Nothing's
done
new.
before.
I mean, when you look at it, and you just feel, well, they got it absolutely down to a T.
And we've said before on the podcast that it's strange that Adam will take an apple and then God curses the deep sea fishes to eat each other.
Well,
you know,
that I think is really is that it means that God is a complete ogre.
To make it happen, like,
you know, if God did the curse, I mean, I pointed this out and people don't like it. If the curse actually happened, God is absolutely, you know, repulsively vile.
Because of suddenly changing the world based on someone's
not
action.
Changing it, but just introducing so much suffering. In the words of Richard Dawkins, because just a couple of nudists went scrumping.
Okay.
All right. Okay. On the other side, the young Earth creationists come in the other way, and they don't see the horror of their view of the world suddenly becoming horrific based on someone opening a door or sinning. But on the other hand, they would say that millions and millions of years of a death and suffering process of the evolvement of life and extinction of most species, volcanoes, animals getting trapped in forests, burned in forest fires, has all been part of a millions of years development. And that's the world God created. So they attack that as a big problem with evolution and God. I mean, faith and evolution together.
I don't think there's not an answer
to that one.
Okay. You know, it's that you have to accept that in the natural world there is suffering.
And do you see that as a driver for young Earth creationism, or is it a different source of it?
What I would say is, if you can't explain it, I think it's a driver against, because you just don't know. And I mean, this is why the Christian faith is centered on the person of Christ, who went straight into suffering.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's one of those, it's in one sense not a particularly intellectually fulfilling argument, but I can't see what else you can find. To me, it makes sense.
Yes. I like the theologian who focused on the God who suffers. That seems to be
Jürgen Moltmann, Crucified God.
Yeah, that seems to be it kind of gives an emotional solution to it, even if it doesn't do more than that.
But I don't think there's any straightforward answer. But I think one of the curse, I think, is just horrible.
Yeah. So that's what I was that's where I was coming at it from. That it's not neat, a nice, neat solution. Say God made it perfect, and then it's humans who messed it up. That's the kind of solution that I'm wondering is whether that is a driver for young Earth creationism, or if it's just we need to stick to the literal interpretation of the Bible for other reasons.
I think it's a superficially, superficially satisfying answer, which until you actually probe, it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, not a whole lot works with after probing when it comes to young Earth creationism.
No, nothing does.
No, when you look at it, and I think we mentioned also off air, Michael, about the idea that I saw this great video on YouTube because of this, certainly in the last 5 years, this boom of flat earthism, some of which are very, very fundamentalist Christians, and they've taken the literalism of the Bible to its limit and said, well, in that case, maybe the world actually is flat, rather than saying the Bible, they believed it was back then, but obviously it isn't. And I saw this video where this person was arguing for a biblical case for a flat Earth, but in the video changed it for a biblical case for a young Earth. He just dubbed out flat when they said flat Earth and typed in put in someone's voice saying young Earth. And I realized what was going on. The same arguments are used for the extremist flat earthers, and actually reel it in a bit and say the same arguments, but just put young Earth in there. And it's the same thing. It's all basically saying that the Bible says this, we believe it, so we cannot accept science. It's the same principle.
You've got to take into account that the Bible was written way before there was any science. I know you got this classic atheistic argument against Genesis. It was written by Bronze Age goat herders, which is nearly as stupid as a creationist, because it doesn't take into account that those people in the Exodus would, nick their thought forms from the Egyptians, who were by no means thick, or from the Babylonians, who were no means thick. What we need to do, and I think this is where John Calvin, for all his faults, was very, very good when he says that the Bible is accommodated to the understanding of the common man. It's not a scientific textbook. And in his commentary on Genesis, he says, he who would learn astronomy and other recondite arts, let him go elsewhere.
Yeah, I heard, was it Augustine? You may know this. Was it Augustine who, or one of them, that when they had just was starting to think that the Earth actually was, well, they knew it was a globe even back then, but, well, at least most people I think did. But when they were starting to think of human beings on the other side of the planet, I'm sure I read somewhere that Augustine said, well, if they are, then they must have come from Adam or something like that. So there's trying to, you can see them working through the implications of what that means.
Well,
and
Augustine,
I'm not sure if it was Augustine or not, but
Augustine wouldn't accept the Antipodes, but he has got this wonderful quote, where he points out that people make a mockery if they know a little bit. And then
that's the one I'm thinking of. Yes.
I could find it somewhere. It would take me 2 minutes to find it on my computer. Yeah. But this is it. And you can't expect people of 1000 BC to be aware of the science today. It's the same. Some creationists criticize Darwin over genetics because his understanding of genetics was a bit confused. He went for blending inheritance, but it was not out at that time, so he couldn't do it.
I've heard the same thing with original continental drift ideas, with full understanding of where we are now with plate tectonics, that they do relate, but continental drift was an early form before you'd got the full picture. And maybe now we haven't even got the full picture, but we've got a bigger picture, and it all sort of fits in. But you can't really blame a continental drift original ideas because it's a work in progress of understanding.
But if you look at the continental drifters of the early 20th century, Wegener, Holmes, and the South African Dutoit, they were very, very good.
Yeah, and also they laughed at the beginning. They were ridiculed at the beginning, weren't they?
Not entirely. I think more in the States, but Holmes was widely respected throughout Britain.
Yeah,
the States were very, very slow, partly because they considered too much of one of their leading geologists of the time of Darwin, James Dwight Dana, who was really looking at a very providential view of America, that it had grown geologically.
Okay.
And that would exclude continental drift.
Yeah.
It's the most intriguing thing.
Because I heard, actually a few years ago, but this was Richard Attenborough talking about when he was taught at uni, that being told that this continental drift idea was ridiculous and
pure moonshine, he said. Pure moonshine. His academic senior or whatever said until someone can give him, that's at David Attenborough's teacher or whatever, or lecturer, a mechanism, then he wouldn't accept it as pure moonshine. But of course, then it came to be accepted through a mechanism that was understandable. But
so, Michael, imagine you met a young Earth creationist who was open-minded, and you wanted to sort of explain from science why we absolutely know for sure that the Earth is billions of years old. How would you do that?
I find one thing it's quite tricky because it would depend on the person. But I do know that one friend of mine had almost fallen for it. And I just felt the best thing to do was to convince him that the Earth was ancient. Notice I didn't say 4.5 billion years old, but it was ancient. Get that seed in and not move any further.
Yep.
In other words, once that's in, it'll spread.
Yeah. And how would you convince them that it's absolutely clear that the Earth is ancient?
I'd probably do it on layers of rocks.
Carry on.
You know, saying about all the different layers of rocks, you know, which needed the time. And I would have probably described things which were familiar to them.
So what layer of rocks would you talk about to show that it couldn't have been deposited in the flood?
Well, I could talk, you know, depending if I was up here, somebody up around here, I would talk about the different strata you get.
Yeah, up here is Preston.
Yes, and that would be Carboniferous with Triassic on top, and then you have the glacial rocks. So you got all sorts of questions on time, and I wouldn't be over specific about the time. Or if I was down in the south of England, it would be chalk overlying clay and things like that.
Yeah. So how do you know that chalk? I can picture chalk and clay, because I am in the south of England. You couldn't you say, well, you know, the beginning of the flood, there was lots of silty water and it settled and became clay, and then somehow something happened to make chalk on top. How is that impossible, basically?
Where you have more clay on top of the chalk. You don't get one level. I mean, if you start looking at all the different strata, you get, you know, sandstone recurs, limestone recurs, clayey stuff recurs, and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's really, you know, often you don't have that much time, and I think the important thing is to gently give one thing. In fact, I was disagreed with somebody from the National Council of Science Education in the States when I said, if I'm dealing with this, I don't bother about evolution. I just try to convince them that the Earth is old. And I don't even go for 4.5 billion years. But if I can get them to think of the Earth being a good million years old, I reckon that's it. I've done it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that that's quite a good approach, particularly if you start off with superposition of the lower strata being laid first with certain types of fossil in those. And as you go up, you get the modern species in the higher layers. And apart from where things have been turned over in I suppose, floods of certain sorts, and sort of mixed up a bit. But generally speaking, you can create this, you know, like they say, a rabbit is not found in the Cambrian, as we know today, so far.
I've got a picture of one with a rabbit in the Cambrian.
Oh, really?
I'll send it to you.
So what? So what was that then?
Oh, come on! It's a Photoshop.
It's Photoshop, because that's what they say. You know, if you find a rabbit foot in the Cambrian,
pre-Cambrian, yeah.
Pre-Cambrian, sorry.
No, this is the rabbit in the Cambrian.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, I just think, you know, that it's like anything else. If somebody comes and punches you on the nose, you react badly. If someone's nice to you, you listen. So I think the thing is, you just gently get 1 point over and let that work its way through. Funnily enough, this friend now would, you know, in his group of churches would take on any creationist.
Well, one of the most powerful things for me that I feel if I was talking to somebody just on this level alone is actually pointing out that young Earth creationists, when you get into their system, at least most of them, they have the most rapid form of belief in evolution that you can ever have. Because when you got, which is ironic because they're against evolution, but when you've got these animals that are non-predatory, and they develop and evolve into predatory creatures in the cycle of life in red and tooth and claw in a short span since they all left the ark, is an incredible form of adaptation and change to the environment, so fast that no evolutionist could say it can happen that fast. And so have you written about that aspect?
No, because I think that on this, I think you got two things. You got one is the person you're talking to, and the other is yourself. And I think it's a case of working out what seems to be right to you on this. And I would not go down that line.
Because I've spoken it to people, and it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't think we believed in evolution.
Well, I would not tend
pointed
to use
out.
It.
And they've said you've pointed out that I am a massive believer in very fast evolution, because if you define it as change over time, and they say, because it's quite is it a different species to have something that has the ability to eat and hold another animal and digest it differently than creation?
I tend to think more of time.
Right. Okay. And stuff like that. So I don't know what you would say, Ed, on these, but that's one of mine.
There was this big explosion in the Cambrian period, which is astounding. So evolution was incredibly slow, and then it sped up a little bit, and you got a few different kind of creatures, and then suddenly there was an explosion of all sorts of different life forms, sort of basic body forms, seemed to happen over about 20 million years when life was already several billion years old.
Explosion might give the wrong thing, though, mightn't it? Because you're thinking of it in fast in our times, but that's still over billions and millions of years.
Still 20 million years, but that's a long. It's a long time, but it's very short compared to the slowness that preceded it. And my understanding is, I might be wrong, but I've only heard bits and pieces, that the reason for that was suddenly animals started eating each other, so they had to suddenly work out ways of escaping or catching each other, and so a whole new set of tasks was introduced, and that's why suddenly life forms.
I haven't heard that one, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah,
I think the main reason is that the use of calcium carbonate in shells.
Right, so that was like an innovation, and suddenly it spread.
Which is, I think, is possibly a result of the snowball Earth, because you got after the last Precambrian glaciation, there were very thick loads of carbonates, and that would change the composition so that they were liable to precipitate out, and they could conveniently precipitate onto animals, giving hard parts. But I'm not well enough in it. I'm better at describing Precambrian glaciation because I looked at it.
I think we're winding up, actually. We've had a lovely talk.
So to wrap up then, Ed, what would you want to say?
Well, I do not see a conflict between Christianity and science. There are certain times where you, as it were, if you can imagine, you go on roller skates and you're on rails, and the rails go right apart, and you nearly crash, and then they come together again. So it's one of those things that I think if you want everything sort of neat and tidy and all buttoned up, you're wasting your time. If you can live with a certain amount of discomfort, I'd say, rather than conflict, I think you're better off, where you can see that, it comes and goes, how you see things fitting together.
So suffering seems to be the big issue today to talk about for any of these views.
Is what?
Is suffering. It's the whole topic. That's where everyone comes in. They hone in on the suffering of the young earthism side, suffering of the old earth creation, suffering of evolutionary. It's where we feel, isn't it? So as human beings. So So on that note, though, Yeah, we can
Yeah.
end this, but I think it's really made me think even more than I usually do on it. So it's like, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I hope anybody that's been listening to this has been finding it very interesting, stimulating for your own research and study. And so until next time, I have been Andrew, your host.
I've been Ed.
And
Michael.
Bye.